Donald Trump's repeated suggestion since taking office in January 2025 that Canada should become the 51st state has backfired spectacularly. What he likely intended as a show of dominance has instead stirred a wave of defiance and pushed Canada to look beyond its southern border for security and prosperity. Calling the Canada-US border an artificial line, Trump promised Canadians a massive tax cut and tremendous medical care if annexed, and even pressed Prime Minister Mark Carney with the claim that it won't make economic sense for Canada to build those cars. When Carney shot back that there are some places that are never for sale, Trump coolly replied he would not rule out a wonderful marriage between the two countries. His further demand that Canada pay $61 billion to join his Golden Dome missile defense program, free if Canada abandoned sovereignty, was condemned by Canadian officials as a protection racket. Rather than intimidate, this rhetoric has accelerated Canada's determination to chart a more independent path, from boycotts of U.S. products to a deliberate push to diversify trade with Europe and Asia. Canadians have responded by doubling down on sovereignty and self-reliance. And that broader shift helps explain why Ottawa has been so active in deepening ties with its European partners. Take Canada's growing engagement with Europe, for instance. When Industry Minister Melanie Joly traveled to Sweden and Finland in August 2025, her message was clear. Canada needs partners in Europe to counterbalance the pressures of U.S. tariffs and a shifting global economy. My goal throughout this trip, she said, is to make sure that we have strong economic partnership with these two countries. For Joly, diversifying trade is not simply about expanding markets, but about building resilience. Canada is seeking to diversify its economy, and the goal is to be closer to the EU. Of course, Canada's dependence on the United States has long been both a strength and a vulnerability. Roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports flow south of the border. But with Washington increasingly using tariffs as a political tool, first under Donald Trump's administration and, more recently, revived under the current U.S. government's push to shield its auto and steel sectors, Ottawa is under pressure to rethink its economic foundations. Joly's visit to Stockholm and Helsinki is a deliberate response to this moment. By tying Canada more closely to the European Union through Arctic allies Sweden and Finland, Ottawa signals that it is not content to remain caught in the wake of U.S. trade policy. And these economic moves are closely linked to security policy. When Sweden and Finland sought NATO membership, Canada was the first to ratify. It was based on the fact that it was in our interest to have more Arctic countries part of the alliance, Joly recalled, but emphasized that economic logic was also at play. We knew that there were strong diplomatic and also economic ties with these two countries. This blending of security and trade is deliberate. For Ottawa, closer alignment with Northern Europe shores up not only the military alliance against Russia, but also opens channels for investment, technology exchange, and Arctic development. That dual approach, using security commitments to strengthen trade, is not new. During the Cold War, defense industrial policy helped secure aerospace contracts and U.S. procurement deals. Today, Canada seeks similar benefits in Europe, hoping NATO solidarity translates into industrial cooperation in defense, telecom, and shipbuilding. But while Europe is an emerging opportunity, the most pressing challenge still lies closer to home: U.S. tariffs. The Canadian auto industry, already challenged by the transition to electric vehicles, is feeling the impact. The auto sector is right now bearing the brunt of the tariffs from the U.S. administration, Joly acknowledged. Her reassurance was unequivocal. We will be there to support the auto sector, to support the workers, and to make sure that they can continue to innovate while they're in a very stressful business environment. Canada's auto industry has been tied to the U.S. market since the 1965 Auto Pact, later embedded in NAFTA and now CUSMA. Yet the recent surge in tariffs, justified in Washington under the banner of protecting American jobs and countering Chinese overcapacity, has swept Canadian-made vehicles into the crossfire. The irony is that Canada, with integrated supply chains and near-identical labor standards, has long been treated as part of a North American production base. Now, Ottawa fears that U.S. protectionism will erode that integration. Still, Jolie framed her response as pragmatic. Ottawa can invest in EVs and new technologies while still defending traditional sectors like agriculture and canola. This is not a choice between one or the other, she stressed. We will be there to support our canola industry and our farmers, and the fact that she was pressed on EV subsidies during a European trip underscores the domestic tensions at home. Farmers and manufacturers both want assurance that Ottawa won't let them be collateral damage in tariff wars. If the US is closing doors, Europe is offering windows of opportunity. Jolie highlighted her meetings with the Swedish Prime Minister, as well as executives from Saab, Ericsson, ABB, and AstraZeneca. The pitch was clear. European companies should expand their footprint in Canada, just as Canadian firms are expanding abroad. ABB just announced $100 million more of investments in Montreal. Ericsson is in Montreal and Toronto as well. We're definitely looking at increasing the investments of AstraZeneca, she noted. And Finland too is central to this story. Quebec's Davie Shipyard recently acquired the Helsinki shipyard, a rare case of Canadian industrial capital moving outward. Jolie underlined its importance. It is the first time that a Canadian shipyard in recent history has bought a foreign shipyard. This deal not only allows Canada to expand its shipbuilding capacity, but also ties into the trilateral Arctic Ice Pact with Finland and the United States. By controlling facilities in both Quebec and Helsinki, Canada positions itself as a global player in icebreaker production, a strategically vital industry as the Arctic sea lanes grow more accessible. What this suggests is a bigger shift in mindset. Canada's industrial strategy, traditionally defensive and inward-looking, is beginning to adopt an offensive posture. Rather than just defending domestic jobs against U.S. tariffs, Ottawa is encouraging its firms to buy assets abroad, expand capacity, and compete in global defense and infrastructure markets. That brings us to another recurring theme in Jolie's remarks: defense procurement, and the economic stakes it carries. Canada has pledged to reach 3.5% of GDP in defense spending. A figure that would vault Ottawa into the ranks of major NATO spenders. It's an enormous amount of investments in our Canadian armed forces, in our brave men and women supporting the defense of our sovereignty and our leadership around the world, Jolie said. But she was equally clear that defense dollars must double as industrial policy. At the same time, we'll be able to invest in our industrial capacity. This approach borrows directly from the U.S. model. Washington's military-industrial base has long anchored its technological edge, from semiconductors to aerospace. Canada, by contrast, has often seen procurement as a cost center rather than a growth driver. By stressing that defense purchases from firms like Saab or Lockheed Martin must come with Canadian investments, Jolie is signaling a shift. When we talk to any company, we want to make sure that these companies also invest in Canada, she explained. So where does all this leave Canada? Jolie framed her European tour as both short-term diplomacy and long-term positioning. In the immediate future, she promised support for sectors squeezed by U.S. tariffs. In the medium term, she touted growing European investments and a forthcoming defense industrial strategy. And in the long term, she envisioned Canada as a country not trapped between Washington and Beijing, but actively shaping global markets in shipbuilding, defense, technology, and clean energy. Still, the central tension remains. Canada cannot decouple from the U.S., but it cannot afford to remain wholly dependent either. Tariffs, especially in the auto sector, make that vulnerability painfully clear. By weaving trade, defense, and Arctic policy together, Jolie presented diversification as both a necessity and an opportunity. We won't let the sector down, she promised Canadian workers, but the real test will be whether European partnerships can genuinely offset the gravitational pull of the United States.